Dr. Craig has an interesting strategy for dealing with the problem of evil. Maybe if he just ignores it, it'll go away. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on the book On Guard by Dr. William Lane Craig. And it's time at long last for Dr. Craig to address the one atheistic argument he feels confident enough to take on. Or at least he feels confident enough to take on part of it. I said last time that the problem of sin and evil is different from the problem of suffering and death, but the more I think about it, the more I think they're just different parts of the same problem. The problem of sin and evil and suffering and death. That's a problem for Christians because they like to believe that their God is perfect, and a perfect God would not have created a world that was corruptible by sin and evil and suffering and death. And of course, believers can come up with all kinds of post hoc rationalizations for it, just like you can come up with rationalizations for anything. But they never work because, well, first of all, these post hoc rationalizations, and a perfect God wouldn't need no post hoc rationalizations. And secondly, the only way you can rationalize sin and evil and suffering and death is by making three assumptions. First, that there's some good things that God can't do without outside help. Second, that sin and evil and suffering and death somehow has a power to do good beyond what God is able to accomplish on his own. And third, that God would compromise his own moral standards by turning for help to sin and evil and suffering and death instead of just settling for a lesser good. That's the problem that Dr. Craig needs to try and somehow reconcile with his notion of a perfect Christian God. And he's going to do that by glossing over the sin and evil part and just focusing on the suffering. Quote, thoughtful atheists do try to provide arguments against God's existence. Undoubtedly, the most important of these is the problem of suffering. When you consider the extent and depth of suffering in the world, you have to admit that it's hard to believe in God. End quote. So he don't even mention the sin and evil part of the problem. And notice how he frames it. It ain't that God's existence is unlikely given the imperfections in his supposed creation. It's that it's hard for us to believe in God. In other words, this ain't a problem with God. It's a problem with us. We're supposed to believe for whatever reason, and the problem is that we find it hard to fulfill that obligation. And honestly, this is just effective apologetics. No matter what the problem is, if you can make it sound like a human problem instead of a God problem, believers is going to like your answer better. And Dr. Craig is pretty dang good at apologetics, or at least as good as apologetics can get. But it does kind of set the tone here. He ain't even started trying to address the problem yet, and already he's deflecting. And he follows this up with two long, tragic stories about innocent kids dying slow, horrible deaths. I'll spare you the details, but it's pretty horrific. And he's using that as a setup for how he's going to try and address the problem of sin and evil and suffering and death, or at least the suffering and death part. His strategy is going to be divide and conquer. Quote, as one colleague once wisely remarked to me, as a philosopher I'm called upon to say what I think about some question, not how I feel about it. And as difficult as the problem of suffering may be emotionally, that's no reason in and of itself to think that God does not exist. End quote. So he's framing the moral issues here as if they was just emotional feelings. If we look at God failing to help innocent kids when they suffering and dying, and we say, that is so wrong, then we ain't being rational, we's being emotional. He's setting our moral values as if they was in opposition to our reason, and therefore we can't complain about God's actions or inactions being immoral, because that's just you and me being emotional, don't you know? But even that don't divide things up enough to suit Dr. Craig. Quote, So in dealing with this emotionally loaded topic, it's crucial that we make a number of distinctions to keep our thinking clear. End quote. And he has a handy little diagram to illustrate how we go about dividing up the problem of suffering in order to foster an attitude of apathy towards human suffering so as we can dispose of the problem without too much concern about how wrong it all is. And don't get me wrong, I was all for dispassionate reasoning and not letting your feelings get in the way of the facts. But this ain't just an emotional issue. God is supposed to be all-powerful, which means his failure to prevent unnecessary suffering is a moral issue. And Dr. Craig is using our emotional reaction to the wrongness of suffering as a way to discard the moral aspects of the problem on the grounds that they supposedly just an emotional reaction. In other words, Dr. Craig's divide and conquer strategy ain't simple good practice in maintaining objectivity. On the contrary, it's an attempt to suppress a significant part of the problem. Quote, I'm convinced that for most people, the terrible suffering in the world is really an emotional, not an intellectual problem. They just want nothing to do with a God who would allow them or others to suffer terribly. End quote. And the implication, of course, is that if this is just humans being emotional, then it ain't a legitimate problem. It ain't that God's inaction is inconsistent with his supposed moral character, it's that humans is just letting feelings get in the way of cold intellectual reasoning. And this tactic does two things. First, it lets believers dismiss the moral dimension of the problem as being merely emotional, and second, it's a pretext for claiming the intellectual high ground. Believers supposedly already has a better case because they's the only ones who ain't letting emotions cloud their thinking. Dr. Craig thinks he can prove intellectually that suffering ain't a real problem. Quote, in order to support my claim that suffering poses mainly an emotional problem, we need to examine in detail the intellectual problem to show that it fails as a proof of atheism. End quote. So his goal is to prove that it's an emotional problem as if that's the same as proving it ain't a real problem. And the first part of his strategy is to try and make it sound as if atheists didn't want the burden of proof here. Quote, in the previous chapters, we were considering the arguments for God, and so it was the believer who had to bear the burden of proof. End quote. And we all know how eager apologists is to take on the burden of proof. He continues, quote, but now it's the atheist's turn. We're considering arguments for atheism. So now it's the atheist who must shoulder the burden of proof. End quote. So atheist has the burden of proof here, and that's fine. Dr. Craig rambles on for a while trying to make it sound like we's trying to get out of it, but we ain't. That's why we's pointing out the problem of sin and evil and suffering and death, which is inconsistent with what we'd reasonably expect in the case where everything was created by a perfect God. The verifiable evidence is more consistent with the conclusion that the Creator God is a myth, and we's more than happy to point that out. But now Dr. Craig has to try and whittle this down to something he can claim to have an answer for. So far, he's whittled away the sin and evil part of the problem, and he's whittled away the moral part by calling it emotional. So now it's time to rephrase the atheist argument in terms that's going to make it easier for him to supposedly debunk. Quote, before you begin to talk to the unbeliever about the problem of suffering, you need to find out which version he's supporting. So just ask him, are you saying that it's impossible for God and suffering in the world to both exist? Or are you saying that it's merely improbable that God and suffering both exist? End quote. And while he's at it, why not go ahead and ask him if he stopped beating his wife yet? The problem here is that this is a loaded question. By phrasing it specifically in these terms, Dr. Craig is manufacturing an argument that will allow him to set the bar somewhere out of the atheist's reach. Maybe he figures that if you average out the low bar he sets for Christianity with the impossibly high bar he sets for atheism, you'll get a reasonable bar somewhere in the middle. But I digress. The atheist argument here ain't that it's impossible or improbable for suffering to coexist with some vaguely defined non-specific God. The argument is that sin and evil and suffering and death is inconsistent with a specifically Christian God, and any gods like him, of course. If an God is all-wise, all-knowing, and all-powerful the way Christians say he is, then all suffering is, by definition, unnecessary. There ain't no higher power that can force God to allow suffering against his will, and there ain't no logical impossibility to keep God from preventing it. So if any such God exists, all suffering is unnecessary. And a God who is perfectly good and perfectly loving ain't gonna subject his beloved creation to unnecessary suffering, let alone all the sin and evil stuff. So the existence of whatever God calls sin and evil and the existence of unnecessary suffering is incompatible with the existence of God as defined by the gospel. And Dr. Craig is going to try and make us think that that ain't a problem. He's broken the atheist argument down into two basic alternatives. Either it's impossible for God and suffering to both exist, or else it's just improbable that God and suffering both exist. And he starts off by addressing the claim that it's impossible. Quote, "The atheist is claiming that the following two statements are logically inconsistent. One, an all-loving, all-powerful God exists, and two, suffering exists." End quote. And that's a valid claim. The all-powerful part would mean that all suffering is by definition unnecessary, and the all-loving part means that if and such a God existed, he wouldn't allow unnecessary suffering. So if the one exists, the other can't. And by the way, if you try to get out of it by saying that, well, God does exist, he just ain't all-powerful, well, that's the same thing as saying that the all-powerful God don't exist. So these two statements, as given, do indeed qualify as being logically inconsistent. Dr. Craig, of course, can't or won't see the contradiction here, so he assumes that the atheist must be making a couple of what he calls hidden assumptions. Quote, "There seem to be two hidden assumptions made by the atheist. They are, 3, if God is all-powerful, he can create any world that he wants, and 4, if God is all-loving, he prefers a world without suffering." End quote. In other words, them silly atheists is making the hidden assumption that words has meanings, and that all-powerful means he has all power, and all-loving means he loves everybody. So I don't really see the problem here, but maybe Dr. Craig can straighten us out. Quote, "If God is all-powerful, he can create any world that he wants. Is that necessarily true? Well, not if it's possible that people have free will. It's logically impossible to make someone do something freely." End quote. Except, of course, that this has nothing whatsoever to do with the problem of suffering. God could prevent suffering from happening while still allowing folks to act as freely as they do today, because there ain't no such thing as unlimited free will. There's certain things that folks can't do, like flapping their arms and flying like a bird. But that don't mean they ain't got free will, it's just that free will necessarily has limits. So an all-wise, all-knowing, and all-powerful God could prevent suffering simply by making it so's folks can't do nothing that's gonna cause suffering. Our options is already limited, so removing suffering and harm from the list of available options ain't gonna take away nobody's free will. God could eliminate suffering without forcing nobody to do nothing they ain't willing to do. But to hear Dr. Craig tell it, free will is God's get-out-of-jail-free card. Quote, "If people have free will, they may refuse to do what God desires. So there will be any number of possible worlds that God cannot create because the people in them wouldn't cooperate with God's desires." End quote. And again, this has nothing to do with the problem of suffering. Suffering ain't a question of imagining how many worlds God would not create. The question is why he didn't create any of the non-suffering worlds that he could have. In order to refute the claim that God has the power to create a world free from suffering, Dr. Craig has to prove that it's impossible for God to create a non-suffering world. And the funny thing is, it ain't really all that hard to make it impossible for God to do something. All you gotta do is show that believers is unwilling or unable to imagine him doing it, just like with any other imaginary God. You take a straight-up self-contradiction like the doctrine of the Trinity, and believers will tell you that God's thoughts is as high above our thoughts as the heavens is above the earth, so he can figure out a way for it not to be a contradiction, even though humans can't. God can do it because believers is willing to imagine him being able to do it. When it comes to God being smart enough to create a world without sin and evil and suffering and death, though, believers ain't willing to imagine him figuring that one out, because if he did, it'd completely pull the rug out from underneath Christian apologetics. And if believers won't imagine him doing it, then he can't do it. Imaginary gods is limited to doing only what believers is willing and able to imagine. So believers is imposing obviously arbitrary limitations on God's supposed abilities in order to try and save the narrative. And this is made all the more obvious by Dr. Craig's strategy of pretending that sin and evil ain't part of the problem and that the only problem is suffering. And I think that's a strategic blunder on Dr. Craig's part, because the free will excuse ain't supposed to be an answer to the problem of suffering. It's how theologians tries to answer the problem of sin and evil. The argument is supposed to be that free will means sin and evil has to exist because you can't force folks to freely choose to be righteous. Unfortunately, Dr. Craig can't use that argument on account of his strategy has been to avoid even mentioning the sin and evil part. He thinks he can do a better job of reassuring believers if he can make it look like suffering is the only problem. But that means that when he goes to use answers that was designed for the sin and evil part, it ain't going to work. An all-powerful God could prevent suffering just by tweaking the boundaries of what folks can and cannot do. And free will already has to exist within these kind of boundaries. So free will can't fix the problem of suffering, no matter how much Dr. Craig would like us to think that it does. He has a similar problem with what he calls hidden assumption number 4. Quote, if God is all loving, he prefers a world without suffering. Is that necessarily true? It doesn't seem like it. End quote. Well, actually, Dr. Craig, it kinda does seem like it, especially since, given God's supposed omnipotence, all suffering is unnecessary by definition. And a God who prefers a world full of unnecessary suffering is a God who ain't all loving. But Dr. Craig wants it to sound like God don't have no choice about it, whether he's loving or not. Quote, God could have overriding reasons for allowing the suffering in the world. We all know cases in which we permit suffering in order to bring about a greater good, like taking our child to the dentist. End quote. The problem here is that you have to assume that God has no choice in order to prove that God has no choice. Suffering can sometimes bring about a greater good, but why? Well, it's because we live in a world where bad things happen that we need to be prepared to either prevent, resist, or endure. But an all-powerful God wouldn't need to create that kind of a world for us to live in the first place. So you can't use the way God supposedly chose to create the world as a reason for why God supposedly had no choice. Take Dr. Craig's example, for instance. Would you take your kid to a dentist if we lived in a world without cavities? The only reason dental care provides a greater good is because we live in a world of suffering. And if a mere dentist can help prevent some of that suffering, then an all-powerful God ought to be able to do a whole lot more. Also, the greater good argument is just a slightly sanitized way of saying that the end justifies the means. And that's a moral standard that's widely recognized as corrupt and malignant. A lesser good without sin and evil and suffering and death is morally superior to a quote-unquote greater good that requires a significant amount of greater evil. Dr. Craig is going to defend the notion that the end justifies the means, though. Quote, some goods, for example moral virtues, can be achieved only through the free cooperation of people. End quote. In other words, an all-wise, all-knowing, all-powerful God can't create moral virtues without outside help. Does that sound kind of fishy to you? Ain't God supposed to be the sole source of all moral values, including moral virtues? Dr. Craig spent all of Chapter 6 arguing that morals is proof of God's existence because moral values can only come from God. And now, just one chapter later, oops, he can't create moral values. And again, this is one of the telltale signs of an imaginary mythical God. His powers comes and goes according to the narrative need of the moment. When you need to use morals to prove he exists, then he and he alone is able to create moral values and write them on everybody's heart. But as soon as you need to account for sin and evil and suffering and death, it's like kryptonite. Poof, his powers is gone. And yet, this is the best that Dr. Craig has got as a defense for the idea that suffering could exist in a world created by an all-powerful and all-loving God. Now he's going to try and wrap it up. Oh, it may well be the case that a world with suffering is, on balance, better overall than a world with no suffering. In any case, it is at least possible, and that is sufficient to defeat the atheist's claim that 4 is necessarily true. End quote. And by 4 here, he means statement number 4 about a loving God preferring a world with no suffering. So he's saying that it's at least possible that a loving, all-powerful God would prefer to see his beloved children suffer unnecessarily instead of settling for a world that was merely good. And all I can say is, if that's what God's love is like, we're probably better off without it. Dr. Craig closes this section with what he thinks is the final nail in the coffin of the problem of suffering. Quote, given human freedom, God's options are restricted, and it may be that a world with as much good as the actual world but with less suffering wasn't an option. If this is even possibly true, it shows that it's possible that God and suffering both exist. And it surely is plausible that this is possibly true. End quote. So let's make the same argument in slightly different terms. It's possible that a meal made out of ingredients contaminated by raw sewage might be more delicious than a meal made with lesser quality ingredients that was free from raw sewage. So it's possible that a perfect chef might be okay to serve you a meal knowing that the ingredients was contaminated by raw sewage. There ain't no reason why God would have to create a non-suffering world that has as much good as ours. All he needs to do is create a non-suffering world with at least a minimal, acceptable level of goodness. If God is as holy and righteous as Christians claim, he ought to find any amount of sin and evil and suffering and death as distasteful as raw sewage in the stew. So that ain't ever going to be part of his recipe for creating the kind of world he'd want to create. And the fact that we live in a world that contains stuff God wouldn't allow if he was real is pretty good evidence that he ain't. And I'm sure there's more that could be said, but that's going to about do it for me for today. Next time, Dr. Craig is going to try and debunk the claim that it's even merely improbable for God to have good reasons to allow suffering. Maybe he'll have better luck with that one than he did with this, but we'll see. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.